Okay, I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today and investing your valuable time in learning with JSA. I am Sharada Oza. I'm a speech language pathologist. I've been working with JSA for about 2 years now, in the role of a clinician and a clinician supervisor. And I've been an SLP for about 15 years now. 13 years. So, welcome to our CEU. Please feel free to add in your questions in the chat, and I can get to them just within the presentation or maybe at the end. Um, and there will be a link that I will attach at the end for us to finish our quiz. Um, Anything else I'm missing, Justine? No. Okay, well, wonderful. Well, happy National Speech and Language Hearing Month. Welcome to our CEU, the missing link and in executive functioning and language. I I want to start by sharing something that I see almost every single week as an SLP. I meet children who can answer questions, they have the vocabulary, they understand language much better than what we might assume. But something changes when they're confronted with real life situations, when there are multiple steps, distractions, transitions, unexpected changes, everything seems to fall apart. And these are the children whose parents will often say to me, yeah, he seems to know everything on paper, but just can't seem to apply it or do what is needed to be done. So, what often looks like that language or communication challenge is not always just that. And there is an underlying executive functioning problem, which is why we're calling this discussion today the missing link. Because if we're only focusing on language without understanding executive functioning, we're missing a critical piece of the puzzle because they share such a close intertwined relationship. So, in today's presentation, we will discuss the definition of executive functioning using clinical frameworks and understand how it underpins everyday language use. We will learn what to look for when evaluating whether difficulties reflect language deficits or executive functioning load or both. We will explore therapy goals that target executive functioning through language goals and understand their functional impact. We will also apply these executive functioning concepts interactively to real clinical cases, including an audience reflection and discussion. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk about executive functioning that is essentially the brain's management system. So, executive functioning is often described using a broad set of domains. A widely referenced framework that we're referring to for the purpose of today's presentation is from the Smart But Scattered series by Peg Dawson and Richard Guare. This outlines the skills as following. There is response inhibition, which is thinking before acting, working memory, holding and using information, ex there's emotional control, which is managing their emotional responses, sustained attention, maintaining focus over time on a task, task initiation, being able to initiate a task independently when an instruction is provided or on their own. Planning and prioritization, which is organizing the steps to reach a goal. Organization, managing the materials and information that is provided externally or just internally, everything that they learn. Time management, to be able to use their time effectively. Cognitive flexibility, adapting to change and unexpected scenarios. Goal persisted, pers sorry, goal-directed persistence, completing tasks despite challenges, and metacognition or self-monitoring, which is evaluating and adjusting their performance. So, when we think of executive functioning as the brain's management system, what this means is that it allows the child to coordinate all of these little skills that are required for them to be successful. And this can include initiating tasks, holding information, in their mind, controlling their impulses, shifting when something changes, planning steps towards a goal, monitoring one's own performance. And so it is not just about intelligence or motivation. It's about that management skill under real life demands. So executive functioning brings together thought, behavior, emotion, and action to help a child achieve goals across settings. The challenges reflect that difficulty managing the skills under load, not a lack of knowledge and understanding. When I talk to parents about executive functioning, I I like to use this metaphor for driving, where I described executive functioning as the brain's driver that is following a map to reach a destination. So we imagine the child's brain as a car that is on a journey, and the destination represents the goal. This goal could be completing a task or an assignment, following directions, participating in a conversation, retelling a story. The executive functioning system is the driver that is responsible to get them to that destination successfully. And in order to get there successfully, for a car to keep moving along, there are so many factors that come into play. And those factors are the domains of executive functioning. For example, task initiation is for them to be able to turn the key of the ignition and start the journey independently. Inhibitory control would be like the brake pedal, where they have to stop their impulses or, resist distractions or take impulsive detours on that journey. Cognitive flexibility would be rerouting, adapting to where there's traffic or road closures. Planning and organization would be like the map and the itinerary that the brain has to follow, the car has to follow, and find that most efficient path to the end goal. Working memory is like the GPS that holds the directions and keeps the route in mind. And self-monitoring or the metacognition is checking the mirrors, making sure that the car stays in the lane, ensuring that everything is running smoothly. Now, when this sort of metaphor is used, we think about the car having the driver essentially having being calm, alert, and focused. So when the brain is alert and focused, they can follow directions, adjust when needed, and they can reach their destination efficiently. But again, if this driver is overloaded, overstimulated, tired, overwhelmed, or distracted, they might miss turns, they might forget steps, they take much longer to arrive at the end goal. So in this case, sometimes it's the GPS that's unclear. So it could be working memory that's impacting their functioning. Or sometimes there are too many distractions at once. They could be, too many instructions given together. So cognitive flexibility and planning and organization could be impacted. And sometimes the fuel tank representing like their mental energy is just running low. And sometimes the road conditions are challenging. These obstacles, they don't mean that the driver lacks intelligence or motivation. They simply mean that the journey requires more support. And so from the outside, it can look like the child is not paying attention or not interested or not understanding. But it means in reality is that the child may fully understand what is expected. They just can't manage everything all at once in real time. So this is where speech pathologists play a critical role. We don't just elevate, elevate. Apparently, at the end of the day, I can't talk. Sorry. Um, we don't just evaluate whether a child knows the destination. We support the skills that help them navigate the journey. And by strengthening executive functioning, we're improving the child's ability to comprehend language, organize their thoughts, engage in conversation, and communicate effectively across settings. So, simply put, the language is the vehicle and executive functioning is the driver. So, when we discuss the multiple areas that are part of executive functioning skills, I want to try and focus on five core areas just for the purpose of this presentation. Um, we all know that executive functioning skills can be a Pandora's box. So, I'm trying to restrict ourselves and stay focused on just the five areas of executive functioning through the lens of language intervention. The first one is working memory, and we are going to go into detail for the goals. So for now, we're just going to focus on the explanation of what these domains are related to language. This working memory is the ability to hold and use information. So, for example, a child may understand a direction when it is given one step at a time, but might struggle when there are multiple steps given together. In therapy, we might target goals with following directions. If they forget what's said or lose track mid sentence, then we would target goals like sentence processing or narrative recall. Inhibitory control. This is their ability to pause, regulate their impulses, and manage responses in the conversation. This often shows up as interrupting, blurting, going off topic impulsively, rushing through responses. And goals might look like conversational turn taking, response regulation, so that is pausing before responding, or topic maintenance, which is something that we work with a lot of children with pragmatic language use. Cognitive flexibility. This is their ability to be able to shift their own thinking, but also adapt their language based on the conversational partner. Um, and consider multiple perspectives when having a conversation with their conversational partner. Difficulty would look like them providing rigid or repetitive responses, trouble with understanding humor or multiple meanings, and difficulty shifting topics. Goals would look like generating alternatives, perspective taking, and topic shifting goals. Another area that I want to focus on today is the planning and organization. Yes, they are two different domains within the clinical framework, but for the purpose of this presentation, we are going to combine them because in the end, they do work together. There is we can't really separate these two as such to really be able to target one versus the other. So we are going to combine them. And often we'll see challenges in writing, we will see challenges in organizing their stories or narratives, or we will see challenges with task completion in order. This could also include missing key details when they're either reading something or writing something or even having conversations, and then sequencing of events. So, goals would look like narrative organization, having them provide a beginning, middle, and end using either visual organizer or, just having them use visuals. Written expression, so organizing written responses using visuals or graphic organizer frameworks, task planning, so verbally describing a task before planning how they will do it. So using language like first I will, then I will, and last I will. The last domain that I want to focus on is metacognition or self-monitoring. This is their ability to be able to notice errors, make corrections, and this is a critical skill for independence. Because if they are unable to recognize their own errors, they will be unable to move forward with correction or clarification. Weakness will often show up as them not noticing their errors or correcting their errors. They will sound verbose. There may be tangential outputs provided. Their responses may seem off topic. A lot of times they may be unaware of when their message is becoming unclear and whether that other person is able to understand what they're saying. So goals might target monitoring for clarity, so evaluating their own verbal or written responses, um, being able to use repair strategies for repairing communication breakdowns by rephrasing or clarifying what they have to say, and work checking. So checking on their own verbal or written responses using a checklist. Diving into assessment and differential diagnosis. When I um oh, I was just noticing a hello. So hi from California. I am in Oregon. I should have mentioned that earlier. Um, so when I assess a child, I don't try to separate language and executive functioning into two different categories. Instead, I assume that they both are contributing. And my job is to be able to understand how they're interacting with each other. So while I use formal assessments, I also place equal importance on how the child performs in functional real life tasks. Because what matters most is not just what the child knows, but how they access that knowledge in real time. So, in order to do this, I tend to apply a three-layer assessment approach where we look at formal language assessment, standardized language measures to be able to understand their vocabulary knowledge, their sentence structure, syntax comprehension, and their narrative ability. These tests will tell me if the language system is in itself intact. And then we work towards dynamic and functional observations. This is where executive functioning becomes visible. So I observe how the child approaches a task. For example, if they show overt signs of avoidance or anxiety, sometimes shows up as well. Um, and then we are also looking at whether they need extra cues. We look at whether they need incentives, whether they can start their tasks. Oh, I'm so sorry to do that. Whether they can start their tasks independently, um, and then whether they how they respond to increased demands. What does that breakdown look like? Whether they demonstrate sudden frustration, how do they then manage that frustration when they get stuck? What does that emotional recovery look like? And lastly, I focus on contextual caregiver and teacher reports. So I know that a lot of our roles may not necessarily involve correspondence and collaboration with teachers, but it in that case, for in my role especially, I always ask the parent what are the concerns that the teacher voices in the school and gain consent from the teacher or from the parent to be able to contact the teacher and have a discussion with them whenever I can incorporate that within my evaluations. Um, we don't we we want to be able to look for what they are telling us. And yes, sometimes caregiver reports can be inconsistent, and that is why this is more of a hypothesis building task where then we align it with what we observe in our dynamic assessments. From parents, the reports that I look for would sound more like, oh, he gets bored easily and needs to change the games frequently. He might show like he's super interested in a task one day and then the next day he's over it. He wants to join this hobby all of a sudden, but then after a few classes, he's over it. He doesn't want to do it anymore. Or, they might tell you, we can't really tell whether he's going to have a good day or a bad day. It just kind of depends on the day with him. That would indicate that inconsistency in access to the management skill. He sometimes they might tell you, oh yeah, he gets really frustrated when he has to do his math homework and he tries to avoid it at all cost. These are some of the skills that will tell us what executive functioning looks like. Is he able to regulate his emotions and goal-directed persistence for a task that is hard for him to do? Um, Getting back into the classroom is a major transition difficulty for this child. That is another report that I hear frequently from report caregivers and teachers both. They'll say, "Oh yeah, they break down and cry and have a tantrum." This sort of breakdown obviously indicates emotional control, and we have to find how to provide them with that support in that scenario to be able to follow their executive functioning and help that management skill focus on what needs to happen, the goal at hand. They might also sometimes, tell us, yeah, this child, they they go to school and they're little angels. They come back home and they're a mess. And so that really is indicative of an executive functioning load on some level because they thrive when they're provided with a predictable structure. But as soon as they come home and that structure disappears, their brain goes into disarray and their body and their brain can't function because their structure has been taken away and they don't have anything to rely on. So these patterns will tell us if that issue is not just the skill, but it's the management of the skill under load. And so if a child can do something when the support is provided to them, that exact and they cannot do it independently, then it is likely, quite likely, that executive functioning plays a role in achieving a task and being successful at existing. So this is more of a cheat sheet that talks about what I look at for every domain, how I test it, and what tells me if it's an executive functioning issue or a language issue. So this could be something you can refer to look at each of these factors. But let's go into one step deeper and really talk about what each one looks at. And I'm always asking myself, which part is breaking down? Is it executive functioning or is it a truly language deficit? So in order to do that, I would tend to compare areas that seem to work together in a sense. For example, working memory versus language. So, what it would look like is that they cannot follow multiple step instructions, they forget what was just said to them, they lose track mid sentence. A way to test this would be to provide them with smaller steps, reduce it to one step if needed, um, add visuals to your support, be able to repeat information to them if that is required. Um, with these supports, if you notice that there is consistent improvement, it is likely that they have the knowledge for it and working memory is more of an issue. If the breakdown continues to persist, there is an active relationship between language comprehension and working memory there. And language comprehension may be the greater barrier in that relationship. In terms of therapy goals, some examples of goals that would target both executive functioning and language together. And this is a lot of these goals I'm sure you're already targeting with your clients. An example would be following 2 to 3 step directions that are verbally presented to a child. When we're presenting verbal instructions, the executive functioning skill that we're working on is holding and sequencing information. And then we're also working on a language area of auditory comprehension. If you're working on sentence processing, so recalling and responding to verbally presented sentences by identifying key details, you are working on information retention for executive functioning, and then you're working on comprehension and recall for language. Narrative recall, so retelling short narratives of 3 to 5 sequences of events using visual supports, or, again, these are example goals. The supports may differ for every client. So take this as just a mere example and then think of your clients who might require more or less supports in this scenario. When you're working on narrative recall, you're also working on sequential working memory and then the narrative organization aspect of language. Inhibitory control kind of interacts a lot with pragmatic language. What inhibitory control looks like would be interrupting, blurting, going off topic, rushing through your responses. When I'm testing it, I will provide them with structure. So turn taking cues, gesture cues, visual cues, or I might model expected responses and then give them the opportunity to try and respond similarly. If with this kind of support, I see an improvement, it is likely that inhibitory control is the greater barrier. And if the breakdown persists, it is more of a pragmatic language deficit. Some of the goals that I would work on to target inhibitory control along with language would look like conversational turn taking, where they have to um, take a turn in conversation, wait for their turn. This would be the inhibition aspect of executive functioning, and then language would be our pragmatic language skill. um, when you're working on something like response regulation, where they have to pause and wait before responding and utilize a strategy like wait, think, and answer, you are working on impulse control versus, and for language, you're working on response formulation. So more like of an expressive pragmatic language task. Topic maintenance, when you are working on maintaining a topic of conversation through 3 to 5 conversational exchanges, you are working on the inhibition and impulse control together. And then for language, you're working on pragmatic cohesion. I do want to explain just the difference between inhibition and impulse control here. Inhibition is more of an umbrella term where they have to suppress their responses before it has even happened, while impulse control is for them to stop their action and then go back and then think about it and do it and then provide the response. So that is kind of why inhibition and impulse control are being talked about differently. They do work together and they do intertwine quite significantly, but just for this, for us to be able to understand what is being worked on here, I have differentiated between the two. So, talking about cognitive flexibility versus language formulation. Once again, reviewing what cognitive flexibility looks like, it could be difficulty in shifting topics, rigid or repetitive responses, and trouble generating alternative solutions or answers. The way I would test it would be to ask for multiple responses, or ask them to provide me with, oh, what would be another way to deal with it. So that could again be like perspective taking. And then I would change the context slightly and see how they respond to it. If providing that support improves their skill, it is more likely that cognitive flexibility is a greater barrier. But if the breakdown persists, it is more likely that expressive language is a greater barrier in that scenario. Goals that I would target here are generating multiple responses. So providing us with 2 different responses or solutions to a scenario or a question. This would be targeting cognitive flexibility in its entirety, or and then expressive language at the same time. Perspective taking, identifying and explaining another person's perspective in social scenarios, that would be shifting perspective and targeting pragmatic expressive language in that scenario. Topic shifting, appropriately shifting topics when prompted during structured conversation tasks. This would again be flexibility, but for the language area, it would be more discourse skills. Planning and organization versus narrative language. Review of what that looks like is there would be disorganized storytelling, missing key details, poor sequencing of events. You would provide them with tons of visuals in that case, provide them with story maps. And with these kinds of supports, if you see an improvement, it is quite likely a planning and organization barrier. And if the breakdown persists, it would be narrative language. That would be kind of my focus to start with. Examples of goals that we can see this sort of relationship in would be narrative organization. So for them to be able to provide us with structured narrative, so the beginning, middle, and end, using a visual organizer or depending on whatever supports work best for your client. In this case, we are working on executive functioning as planning, and then for language areas, we're working on narrative skills. Written expression goal could look like organizing written responses using a visual planning framework. This would target organization along with written language expression. Task planning could look, a goal for task planning could be verbally describing a plan before completion. So utilizing language such as first I will, then I will, last I will. This helps them prioritize tasks. Obviously, if you think about it, this is all working together where there is planning, prioritization, and organization in each and every goal, if you think about it. Um, but for the sake of it, we are still providing the providing them with prioritization as their main focus in this goal. For the language area, this would be expressive language sequencing. And then lastly, we want to focus on self-monitoring. One of the biggest reasons why I want to focus on this skill is it is critical to independence, as I mentioned. What this would look like would be they don't notice any communication errors, they don't repair breakdowns, and they're unaware when their messages are unclear. The way I would test this would provide them with verbal prompts such as, did that make sense to you? Do you do you have how did you think that went? Or what do you think they understood here? Or I would model self-correction. When when we see an improvement with that sort of questioning method, or even providing them with the models that they can then follow and imitate, that would be more of a self-monitoring barrier. And if the breakdown persists, then it would be more of a metalinguistic language deficit. Examples of goals here would be self-monitoring for clarity. So they're evaluating their own verbal responses for clarity and using prompts. So again, like asking them verbal questions. The executive functioning area that we are targeting in this scenario is self-monitoring. And then metalinguistic awareness is what we'd be working on for verbal responses. When we're working on repair strategies to repair communication breakdowns by rephrasing or clarifying when prompted, we're working again, for this particular area, it's really monitoring of all kinds. Um, but then for the language aspect, we're working on social skills and pragmatics. When we're working on work checking, where they review completed verbal or written responses, we're again working on monitoring, but we're also working on comprehension of their own content. Moving on to case studies, we are going to be talking about two cases here. We will talk about one case where we will go over everything that was highlighted and practiced with that client, and then we will move on to a case study discussion where I will provide you with the details and we'll go over questions together. So, Ben, who is 13 years old, was this is a really this is a client that I do want to highlight because it does provide a slightly different pattern from what we see. And it is important for us to recognize this pattern and start thinking about executive functioning as a very close contributor to their language skills. The 13-year-old student, he was receiving speech therapy services. He was initially referred for concerns with intelligibility, fluency, and difficulty expressing ideas clearly. So the standardized testing revealed expressive language scores of 105, which is in the 63rd percentile, well within the average range. And their receptive and expressive language was adequate for their age. But when it came to their functional communication profile, things looked different. He was not only observed with these skills, but also reported to have these skills in scenarios outside of the speech therapy room as such. Um, he was demonstrating verbosity. He provided tangential responses, difficulty organizing his ideas in a way that was clear and efficient for the listener. His speech sample showed that While he had the knowledge and the vocabulary, he struggled to convey his thoughts concisely and cohesively in real time. This was also seen in his fluency profile, where, when he was trying to provide and organize his thoughts, he was engaging in frequent fillers and he was rushing through his responses. So, it looked like more of a cluttering profile in that moment. So we see that mismatch here of strong language skills, but there's a breakdown in real world communication. There, this is where executive functioning became critical to consider. So we looked at the executive functioning profile through the caregiver reports using the brief, which is the behavior rating inventory of executive function. Um, Most of his areas fell within average range, but one area that stood out was task monitoring. His task monitoring score, it fell within the clinically elevated range, suggesting significant difficulty checking his work, noticing errors, and regulating his output in real time. And this aligned perfectly with what we were seeing functionally and what was being reported to us from parents and caregivers. So, you know, Ben was not lacking language. What he was lacking was the ability to monitor his output, recognize when his message was becoming unclear, and adjust his communication to match the listener's needs. So what looked like, oh, he's being verbose, he's not being clear, was actually a breakdown in self-monitoring within the communication realm. This also showed up, like I mentioned, in his fluency profile as cluttering. So, again, it was more of a regulation issue, and it reflected difficulty in managing his time, his pacing, and organizing his language in real time. So, when we think about executive functioning domains, the primary area of breakdown was self-monitoring with an impact on his planning and organization of language. And this completely shifted the intervention approach. Instead of focusing on just his fluency and his language, we've expressive language, we focused on increasing his awareness of his communication breakdowns, teaching strategies to pause and organize his thoughts before speaking, and using visual and verbal frameworks to support cohesive express and concise expression. Building in opportunities for self-evaluation and repair, because the goal was not to teach Ben what to say. The goal was for him to know how to access and how to say it in real time. So access those management skills that then could help him with knowing what to say. So in as these supports were introduced to him, his communication became more and more effective. And, because not because his language improved dramatically, but it was because his access to the language had become more regulated. So in this case, it's an important reminder for us that strong language skills don't always translate into effective communication. Communication depends not just on the knowledge, but the ability to access that knowledge through monitoring, organization, and regulation of that knowledge in the moment. Um, for him, this skill existed, but that access was inconsistent. And as self-monitoring supports were introduced, his communication improved. So not, and, we want to be able to make sure that he was able to continue to do that. So it was also then provided with home training programs. Um, let's move on to talking about a girl who was referred initially for with a diagnosis of delayed speech and language skills to Justine Sherman Associates, and she received 2 years of speech language therapy. On reevaluation, she achieved age-appropriate scores on standardized assessments. So on paper, she was caught up. She could have been discharged from speech therapy. She was age appropriate, but functionally things were not improving. Um, the way everyone expected. Parents were reporting the same thing at home. I was noticing the same thing within my sessions. We continued to see that she was not able to communicate and function effectively in everyday situations. For example, when asked a simple question, what did you do over the weekend? She would sometimes recall events from years ago, and I always needed an adult present to corroborate her information. So her information was never fully reliable to me. She struggled with concepts of time, like yesterday, today, tomorrow, and placing those events in a sequence. She lost track of multiple step instructions, even when they were routine based and something that she would have been doing all day long, every day. She'd be, for example, like when she'd have to get ready for school. She does that every day. She knows the steps. She's supposed to brush her teeth, change her clothes, comb her hair, wear her shoes. She'd still lose track and get distracted with other things. Um, she could not maintain a topic of conversation and went off track frequently in our conversations. She had a difficulty interpreting social cues and body language, and this impacted her ability to form close peer relationships in the school environment. So, thinking about this mismatch, there was age appropriate language scores. Again, but there was a significant breakdown in real world communication. Um, from everything that we've just learned about the functional breakdown, let's discuss some of these questions and try to answer them together. We will identify a breakdown. We will map the executive functioning domains and executive functioning versus language as a differential diagnosis. And then we will think about intervention and what an appropriate starting point will be. So for the next part of our presentation today, if you feel comfortable noting down your answers, or putting them down in the chats, whatever you're more comfortable with, please go ahead and do that. I will stop at every question to give you the time to collect all the responses. That is a really good question, Cynthia. I will get to it. Let's complete this case discussion and then we can kind of talk about time concepts. It is a very tricky scenario. So, based on observable behaviors described, which area represents the most significant functional communication breakdown for this student? You can go ahead and type your answers in the chat or maybe just make a note to yourself because we are going to discuss these answers as soon as we finish the 4 questions. I see everyone's answers kind of coming in through chat. So I am going to move on to our next question if everyone is ready. Oh, did I move on? Yep. Okay. I don't know why it didn't show up here. Um, Her reevaluation shows age-appropriate standardized language scores. So what does this most likely indicate? Yep. And then thinking about how she recalls events from years ago, when asked about recent weekends and that she can't sequence events in time, which executive functioning domains are most directly implicated? Okay. And the last question, given this profile, which therapy approach is most clinically appropriate as a starting point? Yep. So let's move on to discussing some of these answers. For the first question, based on the observable behaviors described, which area represents the most significant functional communication breakdown for this student? If you answered C, you are correct. Her vocabulary and language structures are adequate. She met standardized language targets. The breakdown is in organizing and regulating that communication in real time, which a- as we've discussed for the past hour, is the hallmark of executive functioning difficulty and not just a core language deficit. Moving on to question two. If you answered B, you are correct. Her reevaluation showed age-appropriate language scores. So what does this most likely indicate? This indicates that real-world communication requires executive functioning skills such as initiation, sequencing, monitoring, regulation, and standardized tests don't capture this. Standardized language tests don't capture this. And so this is a central distinction between language knowledge and language use. They might have the knowledge of that language, but can they use it to communicate functionally? She recalls events from years ago when asked about recent weekends and cannot sequence events in time. Which EF domains are most directly implicated? If you answered B, you are correct. So recalling past events instead of recent ones reflects a working memory retrieval difficulty. And this, Cynthia, kind of is where my answer is going to lead with you is, we want to look at working memory first. Can they even hold that sort of information before we even try to target time concepts? Um, so, and then, sorry, let me continue here. As you can see, I got distracted here. My executive functioning skills probably need some help. Struggling with time concepts and topic maintenance reflects that cognitive flexibility as well. So being able to shift their brain from one experience to another, um, they kind of work hand in hand. So difficulty shifting and adapting her responses to the current conversational context. So not so much whether they know the time, but more so about the conversational context as well. That is why these domains they're hard to kind of piece out separately and string them out separately. We have to see them as one whole unit. One impacts the other. This is how it works. When there isn't cognitive flexibility and working memory, we are going to see that time concept be impacted. And yes, I will go more in detail for your answer, Cynthia, but for now, that's kind of what I wanted to target or address. Given this profile, which therapy approach is most clinically appropriate as a starting point? If you answered C, targeting executive functioning skills through functional language tasks, you've been listening all through and through, and you are correct. Um, since core language is intact, the priority is to target executive functioning skills so that she can access that core language. It is the main disruptor in this situation. Goals addressed should work on working memory for recent information retrieval, self-monitoring on topic responses, and cognitive flexibility for time concepts. All of this delivered through language-based tasks, through like the examples of the goals that we were talking about earlier. In her specific scenario, I worked on working memory to help with recent task information or recalling recent information, and for working on losing track of tasks and multiple step instructions. We worked on cognitive flexibility to shift between time concepts. Yes, in this case, there was a heavy use of recall supports, visual supports, and heavy use of just constant external monitoring from mom. And then cognitive flexibility was also targeting her getting stuck on conversations or uh, staying on topic for conversations. For planning and organization, the difficulty in providing us with organized, coherent experiences, and then poor sequencing of events, like you can see again, that time concept requires all of these factors to work together. And then self monitoring was not recognizing when her responses were going off topic or were inaccurate. So helping her be able to monitor that response through verbal prompts and questions. And then inhibitory control, being able to filter out irrelevant information during conversation and the way that old memories were intruding present context. That is part of the inhibition and impulse control to not talk about that old memory when it's running in her mind. At this point, I want to give you the opportunity to really reflect on some clients that you're seeing and have maybe one of you volunteer to discuss that client and share with us how you would change your intervention or modify your intervention goals and plans based on everything that you've learned today. I am going to stop sharing screen for a minute so we can all kind of turn our cameras back on and maybe one of you can share some information. I see Cynthia raise her hand. I did forget to mention that we are going to be uploading this video on the presentation on YouTube as well for you to be able to refer back to. Cynthia, you have a question?
Oh no, I was volunteering to share.
Oh, perfect. Okay, yes, go ahead.
Um, so the client I have in mind,
Mhm.
is he's he currently has a when question goal, and he's just like you said, on paper, able to answer all the when questions when it comes to like concrete knowledge, such as, oh, when do you wear a seatbelt in the car? When do you wash your hands? Oh, before I eat, something like that.
Mhm.
But it's the time concepts that are tricky to him. And so I've like such as, oh, when uh
When do you eat
like
breakfast?
well, no, he can
Okay.
say in the morning, but like for example, like, oh, when did you go to Knott's Berry Farm? And the question is supposed and the answer is supposed to be yesterday. Um, that's what I mean by time concept of like
Okay.
yesterday, tomorrow, things like that.
Yeah.
Um, so so that's why I was wondering like, oh, when should I? So then I started that's like I had that realization that, something was different. And then after listening to you, I was like, okay, so it's the executive functioning for him that we need to
Mhm.
practice on. Um, that's as far as I got.
Well, yeah, I do want to add another caveat there is it's not that it might be just executive functioning. I also would look at whether he understands the meaning of the words yesterday, today, and tomorrow. What does that represent to this child?
Mm-hmm.
And then talk about, maybe having mom observe during the week about recall, like, oh, today, and having her practice that skill today and give him like a visual of this is what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then have him practice recalling what they did today in the moment. And once he gets that concept, I would move on to tomorrow, this is what we're doing. So it
Yeah.
is a slow, lengthy process. Time concept is one of the hardest concepts for children to achieve. But
Mm-hmm.
yes, I would look first at the concept, whether they understand the meaning of the word and what that represents to that child. And then, yes, it could also be an executive functioning skill. Like if you see that on language, that paper on on paper that language is
Mhm.
intact, then I would look into what that working memory looks like. Are they able to retain that information? Are they able to hold all that information from morning to night or from morning to the next morning? And then I would look at what, is their brain able to shift from, oh yeah, night is over and now it's daytime, so I'm in a new day. So that
Mhm.
that kind of cognitive flexibility. So there's a lot of factors that you might want to look at with this child before you start targeting time concepts as a whole. Another, little factor that I do look at is whether they can tell time.
Mhm.
If this child knows how to tell time, then it is easier to kind of focus on just the concept of yesterday, today, and tomorrow as well.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Thank you.
exactly. Visual schedule to target. So I see Shwarya here is talking about visual schedules to target. So yesterday you had swim class. Again, that is what I would start with as well, is getting the mom to use a visual to first review what is happening today and go step by step. Like, don't try to have him do all of it together. Go step by step and see what he's achieving at every step.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we are at time. I'm going to go ahead and share the link in our chats to, if I can find chats. Apparently, I can't function today. Um, Here is a link to the presentation quiz. And thank you so much for your time today. One key takeaway from today is that, strong communication skills doesn't always mean that they can function in everyday life. We want to try and make our therapy goals as functional for these kids as possible because in the end, we want them to be independent individuals of society.